and observers. The other feature just to note for this board meeting is that we do now actually have the public gallery back, but virtually through YouTube, which I think is very good news for us. I think that was one of the things that was a sort of, you know, we're a public interest board, and you know, it's good to have the ability for people to see what we're doing and be public in what we're doing. So anyway, good to see everyone. Welcome to our second full virtual board meeting. Obviously, we had the check-in in July, and I think that worked well, and we'll be repeating that in October. But it's good to see everyone here. In terms of just moving into the administrative items, I think the only board member we don't have present is James Jung, and you know, next meeting will actually be formally his final meeting, but that's the only apology that we have at the moment. In terms of the administrative items, just a couple of comments. When you look at A3 and A4, obviously those are the tracking tables, IFRS and GFS. We're not covering those today, but they will be important inputs to our deliberations when we start looking at the mid-period work programme consultation. And in particular, there'll be some news or an update just shortly on the GFS side. That will be there'll be a new presentation of that item for next time round as we move into the GFS update process. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. The only other thing to say is thank you very much to everyone for filling in the report on activities and communication. It's amazing how much is going on there. So, you know, congratulations on all the hard work that you're still putting in despite the challenges of the virtual environment. I think that's a very good, list of activities that have been undertaken. And, you know, certainly talking personally, I think, you know, there are, in some ways, you can actually reach a broader audience through, you know, the virtual events than you can from face to face. But as we said in our meeting in July, you lose something in terms of personal contacts and building new relationships and so on. But I think it's still good that we're being very active as a board. So please do keep that up. Anything else that I should note before we move into the item 1?
Nothing else from the staff side, Ian. I think you've covered the key points in the administrative items.
Okay, that's good. So if we move then into the minutes of communication activities, the first thing we have to do is approve the minutes of the June 2020 meeting. Are there any comments or proposed amendments to those? Yes, Lucy.
You're on mute, Lucy. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Thanks, Chair. Okay, on page 6, item 5.2, instruction 3.3 bullet, it says that it will provide a brief progress update on the measurement, heritage, and infra projects. I think there should be a revision in the decision and instructions in the June 2020 virtual meeting on page 1 because the heritage was not included there. And page 14, second bullet and fourth bullet, it's following an approach similar to the heritage access. We said that we prepare AG, but in the decisions and instructions, we refer to authoritative text on page 9. I think we should revise this because the revisions can be in the core text, not only in the AG. The same is true on fourth bullet. We limited our um, we limited AG as the authoritative text, but in the decision and instruction, we were referring to authoritative text. So it can also be in the core. On page 16, fourth bullet, item 11.2, it says require additional disclosures. Should this be included or developed? That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And any reactions, Ross, to that?
I was a little confused whether you're proposing we're changing the minutes themselves or the instructions on the website. Could you please clarify?
All right. I think we have to revise the decision for on page 6. We have to revise the decision and instruction. It should include heritage because it was actually included. And on page 14, revision of the minutes. Instead of AG, we use authoritative text, which is indicated in the decision and instruction. And then we revise also the minutes on page 16. Instead of using require additional disclosures, maybe we can say include or develop additional disclosures. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm now clear on
Yeah.
what we need to change.
So from a process point of view, Lucy, if you can bring those comments up earlier, that helps everyone, because in terms of decisions and instructions, that's why we clear those off immediately after the meeting so that they're fresh in everybody's minds. And also it does now have a ripple effect through into the papers. So if there are sort of omissions in terms of a cross-reference or something like that, then I think we can have a look at making those. But I think anything more substantive on decisions and instructions needs to be brought up at the time that we look at decisions and instructions, because these now just get dropped straight into the minutes. So I think on that, probably if I can leave you just to deal with those offline with Ross and see what can be done on those changes. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up? Okay, so Ross, if there's any minor amendments, if you can just let the board know sort of first thing at the start of the session tomorrow or the following day. Other than that, the minutes are now approved. Can we have a look at the minutes of the July virtual check-in? Any points to raise on those? Okay, so I think I'm not seeing any hands raised on that, so we can regard those as approved. So then we move on to item 1.3, the IFAC board update. And the important item there from the board membership point of view was the fact that IFAC board has approved the membership changes for the board for 2021. We have 4 board members who are being reappointed. Bernard and Mark are reappointed for a final year, and Todd and Nima are reappointed for second 3-year terms. So congratulations to those 4 board members. Now, the other news from the board point of view is that we have 3 new board members joining us next year. Unfortunately, we have to bid farewell to Rod and also to Michelle, who complete their second 3-year terms, and will have an opportunity to talk about what they've been doing and to say farewell to them in December when they finally get to the end of their terms. But also, as probably unexpected for personal reasons, James Jung hasn't applied for a second term. So we had 3 vacancies for 2021, and those will be filled by 3 new members, 2 of whom are women. And what that does is that actually brings the board into gender balance for the first time in 2021, which is actually a major achievement. We're the first of the standard setting boards to actually achieve gender balance, and that's certainly something that we've been strongly encouraged in by the Public Interest Committee. So we will be doing a press release to celebrate that. We will have the 2 new female board members joining us are Renée Pichard, who will be Rod's successor from Canada. And Renée, I think you are hopefully will have joined us in the Observer again. Oh, you're joining us visually. Congratulations, Renée. It'll be great to have you on board. Fantastic news. So well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Very happy and excited to see everyone again, and very honored to be joining you as a member of the board. So thank you very much. And Rod, between you, Stuart, Sheila, and Ron, I have very big shoes to fill, and I really commit to honor the Canadian legacy around this table. So really, really excited to be active again with everyone. Good morning.
You do a great job, Renée.
Thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Renée. It's great to see you, and I'm glad you could join us for the meeting. And the other 2 new members will be from France will be Hervé Adrien Metzger, who is a colleague of Michelle's from the Cour des Comptes. And then replacing James Jung will be Dr. Mari Kobayashi from Japan. So that will renew the contact with Japan, which has been a very good relationship in the past, and we look forward to renewing that. So I think overall, some strong new members, and also extremely good news from the point of view of gender balance. Now, the other piece of news in terms of 2021 is that although he's staying on the board, it's Mike's last year, and Mike is actually trying, although I think Jenny would probably say Mike not very successfully, to retire at the moment, or to at least step down his activities. But one of the things, in addition to stepping down as chair of the Australian Accounting, deputy chair of the Australian Accounting Standards Board, is that he will step down as deputy chair of IPSASB, although remaining a member, and we hope continuing to chair the leases task force. And his replacement will be Lindy, which is also very good news. So well done, Lindy. Really looking forward to working with you in that capacity. So congratulations. Okay, so those are the new appointments for 2021. James, did you want to add anything? There was budget discussions as well in the board.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Hello, everyone. Just to round off, my congratulations personally for all of the reappointments, and to Lindy for towards next year. And I do look forward to a virtual gathering and the innovation of staff, so we can celebrate our outgoing members and these wonderful accomplishments, which we will do in December. The only other point, Ian, I'd add to your remarks is that later today, after your announcement to the board, we'll issue a press announcement communicating what Ian has announced today to the board on membership, including gender parity. Maybe there's three other items just from the IFAC board that I'd like to touch base on very quickly. First, Ian had an excellent opportunity to engage with the IFAC board in September. So Ian shared the floor with IASB Chairman Hans Horgervors for about 90 minutes or so, updating the IFAC board each on their respective boards. If I could say, and I'll just say it in a few short words, a terrific presentation by Ian. It was really, we have a bit of a fun thing. I give Ian scores after each of his presentations, and I noted to him an 11 out of 10 on his presentation. The delivery was great, but maybe I'd share with the board what was really impressive was the content that Ian was communicating. He covered the technical program. It's broad, very public sector specific, ambitious, very relevant. The board's efforts on responding to COVID, agile and relevant and timely responses to this pandemic, and the role that IPSASB can do to help support and assist. Efforts in adoption and implementation, staff publications around ongoing public sector items, but also around sustainability and other developments. Our communications efforts, multiple channels, of course, webinars and seminars and interviews and so forth, and certainly outreach, even in these difficult times with so many major organizations as we continue. So what I just wanted to communicate was Ian did a really great job of communicating all that the board and staff have been working on over the last year and your accomplishments. And so that was, to me, one of the highlights of the IFAC board meeting. There were a couple of questions, discussions, a friendly Q&A with Ian, but a couple of areas that the IFAC board queried about or mentioned, which I guess gives us a little bit of a heads of where their priorities or their area of focuses are. Inquired about our sustainable reporting guide, a Q&A area. That came up in our session, but I think it was one of the areas the IFAC board continues to talk about themselves from a strategic priority. The future and what movements may happen in the future around an IPSASB light, or how do we help adoption and implementation for smaller jurisdictions, smaller governance, and certainly a lot of interest in the momentum to the change in accrual from 25 to 65% across the globe, and an open question of what can IFAC do to help further support that cause. So really, I think a great engagement. The two other items at the IFAC board, I think one was just the budget. Oh, sorry.
To say to board members, we will let you have a look at the presentation. A couple of those items are very relevant, and we'll come back to it for when we start talking about the mid-period work plan review. It's relevant, in terms of where we're going on alignment with IFRS and the number of consequential amendments. That was both addressed in the presentation, but also came up in the questions. And also you'll see in there some first thoughts on things we will need to consider again in the mid-period work program review. So, there's some sort of forward thinking there, which is relevant to our discussions, which will start in December.
Thank you very much, Ian. And if we share that, when we share that, please consider that a great deck as you may need to, as you engage in your own communities in terms of updating so the travel and activities of IPSASB over the last year and moving forward. The other item at the IFAC board, not a controversial item, but this is the time of year in which IFAC approves its own internal operating budget, but also the budgets for the three standard setting boards. I guess on a top side view, IFAC, like many bodies, many governments, many professional accounting organizations, and the major firms IFAC is facing a fiscally constrained environment. The impact of COVID, of course, is affecting entities across the globe. So moving ahead, as we prepared our own and as IFAC approved its own budgets for 2021, we've taken a relatively conservative approach to the budget developments. And overall, within IFAC and the 3 standard setting boards, there's been no significant incremental ask in terms of new additional budgets for 2021. For IPSASB, I'd say for the large part, we're status quo but conservative in our budgeting for some of our discretionary or our meeting and travel costs. And I think there's a bit of reality is we took a conservative approach and assumed that our experiences around virtual communications, we should continue to take advantage of those where we can. The pandemic may continue to carry forward, who knows, but, perhaps possibly into Q1, and it may affect our abilities to travel and resume our normal activities. At the end of the day, I'd say our IPSASB budget for 2021 from a staffing point of view is largely no change, and maybe in fact a slight increase, but staffing is one of my priority budget areas, and maintaining that is my priority, and that's being preserved. We've got largely the same meeting and travel costs, but we've got some reduction as we look to be a bit more conservative in 2021. An operating assumption within those is that we've factored in 3 physical meetings, whereas we normally would have 4 physical meetings in any given year. I think that reflects a bit of a reality that Q1 is uncertain in terms of how and when we might resume to normal operations. The caveat to that budget submission, of course, is that board programming, the needs of the boards to meet, if possible, in person in order to complete and deliver its work program, take priority. And so we have opportunities to revisit and reforecast as we move into 2021. But at this time, I think we've approached it with a conservative but realistic budget. And I think for the large part, our travel, I hope to see resume back to normal activities in terms of outreach and et cetera, but we may find that it's a little bit more of a slower uptick until COVID environment settles. So overall, the budget is, I'd say, conservative, reasonable, no dramatic increases, no dramatic decreases, something we should be operating and looking to operate within reasonably comfortably within 2021. As developments change, however, we will look to reforecast and ensure it meets and supports your operating needs. The only other item, and I think because of the—
If I could just stop you, Rod's got his hand up. Rod, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Ian, and thank you, James. I can wait to the end of your presentation, but I did. Shall I speak now?
Yes, please.
Well, thank you, James. I just wanted to thank you for your conversation respecting budgets. I think it's a very important one. I think not only is it important to demonstrate a high level of prudence with expenditures, it's also important to communicate that as well. And I'm thinking of our situation here in Canada, and I know many other countries around the world have experienced significant budget pressures because of coronavirus. Certainly in Canada, CPA Canada has had to reduce working hours for staff. So for example, there's some staff that were being paid 5 days a week, now they're being paid 4 days a week. As far as the contributions to IFAC by the Government of Canada, and I had responsibility for that when I was Comptroller General, I'm quite familiar with it. I wouldn't imagine those changing, but I think certainly there's going to be a focus on those kinds of expenditures, and at the government-wide level, our deficits are now triple what they've ever been. So the point that I would make is that it's not just the end of the virus, which presumably will happen when there's a vaccine, which may be 2021 sometime, or maybe even 2022. But I think it's well beyond that, because organizations will be dealing with budgetary issues for, I believe, quite some time after the virus takes hold. So given that this is a volunteer board, and given that people travel and are present at the pleasure of organizations that fund them, I really think that discussion that you've had is very, very important. But again, not just doing it, but also communicating it and demonstrating to the organizations that allow all of this to happen that there's a high degree of care with travel and a number of other things. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod. I fully support it. And maybe I'll mention the sentiment. Some people, in budget discussions will say, oh, well, you will just go back to business as usual once the pandemic's over and funding returns. You'll no longer be virtual. You'll just go right back to normal what you were doing. And I think this general sentiment is we all should be taking what we can in terms of a modus operandi, our operating model. We've got tremendous benefit. We see how we can deal with ourselves in a effective way virtually. It certainly reduces travel burden on members. And so I think all of the standard setting boards in IFAC will continue to see what efficiencies, how can we operate from what we've learned operating virtually, and that will build into our new way of working. I think secondly, in terms of a conservative approach, you're absolutely right, Rod. It's not 2021, it's 2022, 23, 24, 25. The effects of the COVID and fiscally constrained environment will likely sustain for the mid period. That's why I think it's important that we learn new ways of working and we can operate effectively and efficiently as possible. Maybe the backdrop just for sharing with the board is IFAC's budgeting exercise, and it's our request for us to maintain, if not find opportunities just to be disciplined in our cost expenditures, does relate for a 3 to 4 year time horizon. So they're looking to build stability within their reserves for surprises. If a surprise funding or a surprise budgetary request is needed, their approach was to take as much of a conservative stance now so that the storm, as we weather the storm over a number of years, there's some stability from an IFAC point of view. And IFAC at this moment is our principal funder. So we need to be supportive of the efforts that they are making to be fiscally responsible and management. The other point that did come up within IFAC was, of course, the need for, I guess, a continued effort to diversify funding for IFAC, as well as the standard setting boards and for IPSASB. And not a long discussion, but it is one of the areas that we know that we should continue to explore and develop in terms of alternative sources of funding, diversified funding for the standard setting boards, for IPSASB and for IFAC as well. Ian, if I may just pop over to two short other updates from the IFAC board. One is they received, and I'll be very brief on this because it's a bottomless pit, but IFAC CEO gave the IFAC board an update on the monitoring group development. As you know, I've reported to you, I guess, regularly in terms of updates on that initiative. In July, the monitoring group issued its final report. If you've not seen it, that's been posted onto the IOSCO website, but there were press announcements coming from IFAC and jointly from the Audit and Ethics Board. Essentially, that has drawn to a close, I guess, a 5-year journey of developing recommendations for governance and change for those two standard setting boards. I think that, I guess I'd summarize it that the solution or where we've arrived at is in a pretty good place, actually. Overall, the paper I think is a good outcome in the sense that while individuals, parties could probably point to 1 or 2 areas where there could be a different solution or a more desirable solution, overall, I think what it is produced a practical manageable and a overall balanced approach compared to the original proposals that were being sought some 3 or 4 years ago. Essentially, I think it's evolution versus revolution. There are a number of features within those proposals. I won't go through any details, but maybe the high points are that both the Audit and Ethics Board, as we know them today, will continue as 2 separate boards. They will continue to be based in New York, and they will largely have the same type of composition, I think from 18 to 16 members. And IFAC will continue to be a principal supporter in terms of service level support, staffing, adoption and implementation support, facilities, and so forth. So very much of today's architecture stays. Some of the changes that move forward is a focus on multi-stakeholder composition at the oversight and at the board levels. Nominations, which is now principally managed through the IFAC function, would move to the oversight, a transfer of nominations from IFAC to the oversight board. And there are other elements of new public interest framework for the standard setting boards, the idea of possibly compensation of board members to enhance their availability and their independence. And finally, a commitment to diversified funding for the SSBs. Now, on the final point, there's a commitment, but no solution. So part of the proposals do talk about the importance of diversified funding, but at this stage, there's been no solution. So at least for the short term, it will continue to be today's arrangements with IFAC as the principal funder. Essentially, I would say this is the end of the beginning. Where do we go from here? There is, I guess, they've identified, a way forward in terms of the next 9 months being an opportunity to begin transition planning. So the parties, IFAC, the Standard Setting Board's monitoring group, the Oversight Board, will spend the next short while just working through transitional issues, how they may be approached, how they might be prioritized, what order, and who may be leading on implementation on those. From there, a transition period of about 3 years in order to put any of the recommendations into operations. The so what for IPSASB, maybe I could summarize in the sense that it's reassuring in the sense that there is stability in the arrangement, and that IFAC is going to continue to play a significant role in supporting, servicing, and providing support to the standard setting boards. It will do so for the Audit and Ethics Board, and it will continue to do so for IPSASB. For me, that creates a stability for IPSASB going forward, or a status quo. And so I think the arrangement is not disruptive in terms of the relationship between IFAC and IPSASB and the standard setting boards. In fact, Kevin Dancy, IFAC Chief Executive Officer, said these reforms do not change our strategy in supporting the standard setting boards one iota. So I think that's positive. The second item is there is a lot to work out between the monitoring group, IFAC, and the Audit and Ethics Boards. There's many items, I guess more questions than answers in a number of areas. So over the next 9 months and 3 years, there will be areas that will be developed. And I guess my point of view is it's an opportunity for IPSASB to monitor. There may be items that progress that we find might be of interest or benefit for us taking on board. I think we should continue to see what developments move ahead, in what way, what makes sense for us to think about, and in due course consider if there's enhancements to the system or to the practices of those 2 SSBs that we might want to take on board. So at this time, I'd probably say it's a good opportunity to monitor, take advantage and see what develops, but not leap or look before we leap. So no action until we start seeing how these items might develop. So overall, a monitoring group, I think a positive development, but at this moment, I don't think any major implications from our point of view. I will stop there, Ian, if there's any questions, and I can quickly touch base on the our own governance review being led by our public interest committee.
Thanks, James. Mike and Rod.
Yeah, thanks, James. And yeah, I was going to ask about our own governance review. So you just mentioned that as you finished off. But Ian, also, are we scheduled? Are we still having meetings with the IPSASB? We sort of had a few scheduled, and then they got cancelled because of COVID and other things.
Yeah, you're right, Mike. We do need to reschedule. I mean, I did actually have a one-on-one with Hans Hugevorst as part of the run-up to the joint presentation that we gave for IFAC board. I think it is going to be important to renew that contact, not least with the fact that Hans's successor as chair is due to be announced, I think, either later this month or in October. And I think building that relationship is going to be really important. They're obviously looking at what their future work program will be, and we need to look at our own. So I think that will be the kind of, the basis. And I think the other thing that will come into it is actually one of the slides that you'll see when you look at the slide deck is by the end of 2022, we will, have substantively have caught up with the huge raft of changes in standards and the consequential amendments coming through from ISB. And I think that will then change the nature of the relationship going forwards, that we can be much more proactive, rather than, kind of, if you like, being a taker of changes. So I think that will change the relationship going forwards. Rod.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, James. I just wanted to make the point that if there was ever an opportunity and a time for IFAC to demonstrate incredible global relevance with respect to accountability and transparency, I would say now is the time. So I think there's a real opportunity as governments around the world work to deal with economic challenges that have arisen from the coronavirus, work to sort through the various social implications of that. It's very important that there be accountability, that there be standards, that there be approaches. So I think it's a very, very opportune, and obviously nobody would have wished the virus on anybody, but it's here. And as we work through it and as governments sort through, I think there's a real opportunity. So if ever there was a time to really step forward, I would say now is it.
Thanks, Rod. So James, brief word on our own governance review and the way that's going to be taken forward with the Public Interest Committee.
Thank you very much, Ian. As the board may recall, we reported in last March a top-level feedback summary of what was an initial review of what survey responses came into the PIC as part of their governance review. The intention was of course to take a further look, a study, and formulate findings and recommendations from that. Now that will continue to happen. However, because of the pandemic, the activities of the PIC, I took a slight pause, a hiatus over the spring and the fall summer period as those organizations pivoted and focused their attention on addressing, I guess, operational matters from their own point of view, so which is fully understandable. The PIC held, I guess the organizations have resumed activities. Their first priority, of course, is bringing to a conclusion this governance review for PIC and for IPSASB. I understand that they met informally in the early part of this month. And an exact date to be determined, but I think we have agreed that the PIC, the IPSASB leadership, and IFAC expect to meet in mid-October for the first full review and discussion of the survey findings, of the stakeholder feedback, and path forward. To me, so far, everything to date suggests the approach will be more evolution than revolution, and that would be consistent with the nature of the feedback that was received on an initial basis. And steady as we go, I suppose, in terms of our own structures. However, I'm sure that there will be important improvements. And I think it's important to conclude our own review relatively timely and efficiently in a good fashion so that we can quickly move on to any incremental improvements within our system. So I think at the moment, more to come. We will have timely engagement with the PIC in next month. I understand that the board has a check-in meeting later part in October, and it may provide a timely opportunity for us to give you an update then on the discussions on the governance review and any other matters we do engage with our oversight board on at that time. And certainly, if not, by the end of this year in December. So with that, Ian, thank you. That's my update. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, James. Scott.
Yes, thank you. James, I did one last question before you get away. You mentioned it when Ian talked to the board, but you saw the recent announcement about the corporate sustainability and the various groups coming together to form. I was wondering what role we see for IPSASB in that effort. Ian, that may be you, but it's James.
Yeah,
but
no,
I mean, cross over there.
There is quite a lot going on. Certainly, there is a sort of proposal that the IFRS trustees may create a sort of companion board for the ISB to sort of look at, if you like, non-financial reporting, sustainability reporting. IFAC is going to publish, if it hasn't already, a point of view, short paper supporting that. There are discussions going on through the corporate reporting dialogue on bringing the frameworks together, and certainly I've had a number of discussions with the chairman of the corporate reporting dialogue, Ian McIntosh, who's a former chairman of this board and also former deputy chair of the ISB, and certainly you know, I've expressed interest that we might have a more active role in the corporate reporting dialogue. So I think, you know, undoubtedly, and you'll see it on my slide, you know, this is going to be something that is going to be, you know, I think really important for us, you know, when you look at SDGs, climate change and things like that, as well as what's going on within the profession in that context. So I think that's a watch this space really, Scott, but certainly, you know, there are a number of discussions going on, and I'm reaching out to various people to make sure that they're aware of our interests.
Yeah, thank you. Government has a big play here. I'd like not to be left out.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if you like, that's IFAC. Now, one of the other things that's been going on over the summer period, it has actually been amazingly busy, is we've renewed our contact with IMF and the statistical community, and that was through Adrienne's efforts initially within IMF, but it's also proved very timely because we're in the early stages of the next update of the overarching system of national accounts and other international frameworks, balance of payments manual and so on. And one of the key events in terms of our part of that was the Government Finance Statistics Advisory Committee met last week virtually. We had good attendance at that, apart from myself, unfortunately being on holiday, but Ross sort of stood in for me. João has done a huge amount of work in terms of input to the papers over the summer, and I'd like to really call attention to that, you know, he's not only worked hard on the leasing project, but he's also been doing that, and believe me, I've seen it in my inbox. There's been a huge amount of traffic on that, and it was also great that Adrienne and Mark were able to support on that. Ross, I don't know, a few words from you, and then any comments from Adrienne and Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. The only thing I'd like to add is I think it's really important that this collaboration's happening now at this time. You could see during the meeting last week, where for the 2 days during the discussions, how important it was to have the different voices from different perspectives speaking about the issues and concerns that should be considered. I think it has been a very collaborative approach thus far. We had our initial meetings going back to the IMF meeting in May, and it was good to see the collaboration continuing. There's still some issues that need to be ironed out in terms of approach going forward that weren't crystal clear at the end of the meeting. But I also wanted to echo the thanks from Ian to Joao in particular from the staff side in doing a lot of the heavy lifting and identifying areas where potential alignment on both the GFS and IPSAS side exist. When you see the dashboard in December, I think you'll get a more of an appreciation for the amount of work he's put into that. And a specific thanks to both Adrienne and Mark for their work on the board side of things. It's really helpful to have people who understand the accounting side of the issues, as well as the IMF statistical side. When you listen to the discussions, it's very easy, myself as an accountant, to get lost in my accounting perspective on everything, but to hear the other side of the coin and the GFS statistical side in the context of accounting is very powerful. So I know Adrienne and Mark probably want to make comments of their own, so I won't steal their thunder, but I just wanted to provide the thanks because it's really been a lot of work, and it's been really helpful to have their support in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Adrienne, Mark, anything you want to add? And I should say this: we will keep you updated on how that's going, and certainly the opportunities that this review presents, we will need to think about in terms of our forward work program. Adrienne.
I do think it went very well. Ross and Joe both gave presentations that were good and excuse me, and I think were well received. What struck me was more than ever before, you can see from the other agencies that they get it, that IPSASB is a full partner. And I think that was established beyond question. You know, that the issue of making sure that that accountants are comfortable and go along with definitions and treatments, I think was much more ingrained in all of the discussions. So it's not that we've got full alignment, but the value of full alignment, I think, has moved forward a lot. So thanks very much to Ian, Ross and Joao for a really good progress in this area. I thought maybe, I don't know how Mark saw it.
Yes, from my side, I think it was very important to attend these GFSAC meetings, how they call it. And although it was nearly 10 another papers to read, almost at the same time of the IPSASB meeting, I think it was very worth going into this meeting and reading them, because when you read the papers, you definitely see room from a conceptual side, even for a better alignment with IPSAS, and not just IPSAS moving to GFS, but also the other way around would be possible, I have the impression. But there seem to be other factors also driving an ultimate decision, but I think it's definitely worth trying to stay committed and to be in the discussion, involved in the discussion. So again, thank you very much also for staff, Ross and Joao, for this excellent preparation, and also the paper that Joao has written as one of these 10 documents.
Thanks both. And that will certainly, the opportunities there will certainly be important for us going forward. So we'll take you through those and the work that Joao's been doing on the dashboard, which has really proved foundational in terms of the discussions that we've had thus far. So the real question is actually how that works in practice, but we'll give you an update on that later. So I think that shows there's been a lot going on over the last few months, notwithstanding the challenges that we've had. I'm going to move us now into item 2. Ross, your report. Anything you want to say on that before we take questions?
Yeah, if I can just give a short intro, Ian. I've just got one slide I want to throw up here. Oops. to frame the discussion. And just to note before we get into the discussions that I know I've received a couple of comments offline about the number of EDs that we have building at the moment to a December approval. I propose that we hold those detailed discussions till the end of the meeting and the final set day of the meeting where we revisit item 2, just to see the progress we've made and the context of that for discussing the work program going forward. Acknowledge that there is a lot of pressure building and we're managing it from a staff side of things. But we think at this stage, it's probably better to have that detailed discussion where we see how far we get this meeting and plan very specifically what's going to come back in the October session. And so we can really start to plan out where we think we'll be for December. And that will be dependent on our discussions on the various items over the coming week. But 2 items I did want to flag in item 2 for specific discussion today that I've asked and provided recommendations for in the paper are the extended meeting dates for the December meeting. You'll recall we started this discussion in June, but got into it a little more in the July check-in meeting. But given the lack of in-person meetings this year, we do think we'll need to extend the timing for the December meeting. And I've proposed a number of additional dates to be added. And I know that might be a problem for some members given their own personal schedules, but I wanted to put the dates we were thinking on the table for the December meeting. So it's an additional 2 days the week prior to the initially booked meeting, so December 1st and 2nd, as well as an additional follow-up day the week after on December 15th to, again, go through more of the admin items and close the meeting out. So that's the one item I wanted to flag. And the second item I wanted to flag is the staff has been working behind the scenes on the overall approach to the consequential amendments that are going to arise from the various EDs coming out. I've summarized in my paper what that approach is, and also highlighting that the October check-in meeting will probably heavily focused on looking at consequentials from a number of the EDs, given the progress we're expecting at this meeting. And to summarize the approach as simply as possible without getting into the details, basically we're working on a per ED basis to identify all of the consequential amendments to other IPSAs arising from the various EDs, but we're also proposing that we pulled together a consolidated list of consequential amendments that will integrate the various consequentials from the all the EDs into one package so constituents can see them all at once. And the other wrinkle to note is then the IPSAS 17 update project. Because we're revising IPSAS 17, we're actually working to collect the anticipated consequentials from each of the projects and integrate those changes directly into the ED to update IPSAS 17, again, to make it easier for constituents to see what that revised IPSAS 17 standard will look like with the consequentials reflected. So with that, Ian, that closes the introductory remarks I'd like to make, and then throw it back over to you and the members on feedback on those 2 points.
Thanks, Ross. So I think if we can just focus on the just any comments on the proposed timings for the December meeting, I'd like to take the discussion on consequential amendments as part of that broader discussion, on Tuesday next week when we've had the meeting. So if you can hold comments on that part of the agenda till we get to then, but I'll just take comments on the timing for the December meeting and recognise that means that it will firstly wrap around the CAG meeting, which is on the Monday of, it's the same date as it was. So we'll have the proposed is 2 days before CAG, and then our meeting carries on after that. But the other thing was, in making that proposal, we were conscious of not wanting to get too much towards the Christmas period in the following week. So that's why, rather than go add-on sessions, we were proposing bringing 2 forward. Okay, Lynn.
it wasn't particularly about the timing of the December meeting. It was about the December CAG and expectation in terms of board member participation or being observers at that. It would be helpful to have clarity on that.
Thanks, Lynn. So, I mean, I think, you know, there is no requirement to observe CAG meetings. That's not a requirement on board members. I think, though, you know, certainly what seems to have been the case is increasingly board members have been, you know, observing the CAG meetings because actually the discussions have been very insightful, and then obviously that feeds back in. I mean, Thomas does a good job on summarising the discussions, but I think there's nothing like actually, you know, hearing those for yourself to really understand, you know, the context and so on. So I think, you know, the encouragement would be if you do have the opportunity, then please do. But if you don't have the time, then, you know, clearly we respect that. And I think Thomas will do his usual excellent job in feeding the points in at the right point in time.
Sorry, Ian, sorry, it was just, yeah. I think in the June one, we were encouraged not to because we were unsure of the technology, but presumably that's now changed for December. That was what I just wanted clarity on.
Yeah, so you're right, Lynn. We did limit the attendance at the first virtual CAG meeting for that exact reason. We weren't sure how the technologies worked. We're using the streaming of the meeting today. And I think now that we're more satisfied the technology will work, I think members will be invited to join and observe in the same way they would in person. So within the CAG meeting with their cameras off like TAs are, should they wish to do that. And then anyone else who wants to attend from the private gallery perspective will be able to access the meeting via the stream so they can at least observe. But members, I think, will be invited into the core meeting itself if you so choose to join.
Thanks, Ross. Rod.
Thanks, Chair. My suggestion would be that you might want to consider a consultation / survey with board members as to, given it's a volunteer board, the time that they can commit. I mean, I'm cycling off the board in December, so I guess the future is really not a huge issue for me. But given the COVID environment, given that the suggestion is that there now be 7 sessions, people may not want to have a public conversation around that at a meeting, but they may have other obligations. There may be implications in terms of the way forward. That survey could also ask questions about budgets and travel and so forth. For example, there may be organizations that have significant budgetary constraints, which may impact the capacity to have in-person meetings in the future. You know, maybe there has to be some kind of a mix. So I just think it might be helpful to have some kind of a consultation around that, given that this is a volunteer board.
Thanks, Rod. Yeah, certainly we do respect that, and we recognise the time constraints, and I think the points around costs going forwards and so on. I mean, I think one of the challenges we face at the moment is we're still very far from being in a stable environment, and we're kind of operating on a meeting by meeting basis at the moment. So, you know, and still with less board time and all of those kinds of things. So I think you're right, when we start to move forward into a more stable configuration, we're going to need to rethink that. I think at the moment, the challenge is actually balancing calls, you know, in terms of members' other roles, and we know that there are conflicts that arise in terms of timing. You know, so I think you're right. When we get a better idea and we get more stability, then we'll need to have that broader conversation. For now, I think the point is really, are we okay in terms of December? And please, if there are sort of personal issues, then you know, bring those up by all means privately with myself or with Ross, and we can also raise anything as well in the in-camera session we'll have at the end on Tuesday. Okay, so I think with that, we move into the first substantive item, which is the ED 73 proposal to defer effective dates and the feedback on that. Ross, I think that's you and Edwin, isn't it? Edwin, rather.
Yes, it is. So thanks to Edwin for taking.
Mark, were you still on the previous item?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Chair, unless I've misheard you. So the work plan, we won't discuss that now. We'll come back to it later in the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So Ross, over to you and Edwin.
Thanks, and just thanks to Edwin for taking this on at short notice. Edwin's going to run you through the item. It should be relatively straightforward. And then when we get to the voting part, again, I'll put the voting slide up again and remind everyone of how we're going to vote on this. So over to you, Edwin.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So I'll jump right in, and we actually only got 3 comments for ED 73. 2 of those comments agreed with what we have proposed in the exposure draft. One of the respondents agreed with most of our proposals, but then they noted that they disagreed with the deferral of IPSAS 41, the amendments to IPSAS 41, and also the amendments to IPSAS 36. And those amendments and the new standard relate to financial instruments. And their basis for disagreeing with us was that they thought that these changes arose due to the global financial crisis from a while ago. And also they relate to impairment and potential risk disclosures, both of which would be relevant to entities dealing with COVID-19. So they thought it wouldn't be a good idea to defer those amendments. So the staff acknowledged these concerns and they are valid, but we've also noted that ED 73 already allows entities to early adopt the standards as they were originally issued. And in the basis for conclusions, we actually explicitly note that. So because of these 2 reasons, the staff's view and our recommendation is that the exposure draft be approved as is. Okay. Let me see.
Thanks, Edwin. So if I can take any comments from members, anybody disagree with the staff's proposal to move forward as proposed? I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think we're good with that proposal. I mean, I think the point on the IPSAS 41 certainly well taken, but I think the ability to earlier adopt addresses that point satisfactorily.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ian.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Edwin.
Oh, I was going to just move to the next slide. So the next item is the formal approval, but.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead, Edwin.
Okay. So the next item was the formal approval of the exposure draft as a final pronouncement. So the staff would like the IPSASB to confirm that they're satisfied that due process has been followed. We're asking for the formal approval of the final pronouncement. And because this is a pronouncement that essentially modifies the effective dates of upcoming standards and amendments, we're asking the IPSASB to agree that this pronouncement will be effective immediately. And the plan is that the next time the handbook is updated, the amendments or the deferral of these effective dates will be worked into those updates.
Ross, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, and I just wanted to note my formal recommendation as technical program and technical director that the ED was issued in accordance with due process. The responses were received and made publicly available on the website. The significant matters in the comment have been flagged by staff and raised for discussion with the IPSASB. And the IPSASB's had the opportunity to consider any other issues raised by respondents. And basically, this is my formal assertion that due process has been followed.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So at that point, are we clear
Yeah.
to the vote then?
Yes, so now we're going to move to the actual vote. I'm going to put my slide up for just 1 second to make sure everyone's clear. So just as a reminder, I'm first going to ask anyone who wants to vote against to raise their hand. I'll then ask for anyone who's abstaining to raise their hand. And then finally, should you approve the pronouncement, all you have to do is remain silent when we get to the third step. So with that, does anyone vote against approval of this as a final pronouncement? So I'm not noting any hands raised, so there are no votes against. Does anyone wish to abstain? If so, please raise your hand. I'm not noting any abstentions. And if you approve, remain silent, but if you do not approve, please raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any raised hands, so that's 17 voting for, 1 absent, because James Jung is not in the meeting. And the pronouncement's approved.
Okay, that's good. Thanks, everyone. Okay, Edwin, anything else that you need from us in terms of finalising this?
No, that was it. I did receive a number of editorial comments, and those will be worked into the final standard.
Okay, and those will be subject to the formal editorial process that we have for finalisation of the pronouncements. So, you know, if there are any members that want to support staff on that, then you're welcome to be involved in the process. Let Ross and Edwin know that you would like to be involved. And then at the conclusion of that process, there is a formal link back from Ross to me with an assurance that in his view there have been no substantive changes as a result of the editing process to the version of the document that was approved by the board. And that's the standard process that we have for any pronouncement, finalisation of any pronouncement or exposure draft now. Okay, so with that, I think we move on to item 4. We will take a break at some point during this item, but I'd like to start discussion first on this. So we move into item 4, and I think, Dave, you're going to lead on this.
Thanks, Ian. So agenda item 4, what we're looking for is approval of ED 74 amendments to IPSASB borrowing costs. This agenda item has been out for a few weeks now, and I've received several comments from members that for the most part are editorial. That being said, there was one that in my view was beyond editorial. I don't think it's significant, but I do think it's beyond editorial. So what I'm proposing for this session is that even though for this agenda item we're looking for approval, what I was planning to do was mark up the agenda item or the exposure draft and bring it back to the board next Tuesday so you can see what all the ads look like, specifically the one that I think is beyond editorial, and then you can approve the document then. In this session today, what I plan to do is I'll still go through the other items I want to talk about, the exposure period and the title of document and any other items that are raised by board members. But again, we'll look for formal approval next Tuesday. With regards to the change that I think is beyond editorial, it relates to 2 examples. In the examples developed, the way they are set up is all borrowing costs that relate to expenditures were capitalized. So for example, if an entity was to borrow 100 currency units, but only spend 80 currency units, the example only capitalized borrowing costs related to those 80 currency units. What the member identified, and I think correctly identified when I went back to the standard, is what should happen is all the borrowing costs related to the borrowings, so the 100 currency units, are capitalized, and then any investment income on those borrowing costs should be subtracted. So you get a similar answer, but not exactly the same answer. And the comment from the member was that should be clarified in the two examples. I believe it's the first illustrative example and the last illustrative example. So again, what I propose is I think it's probably adding a sentence and cleaning the examples up a little. I'll bring those back next Tuesday and look for approval there. Ian, I'll stop there for a second because I'm changing the process a little, just to let you jump in and see if members have any thoughts or comments.
Okay, so I don't want comments at the moment on the detail on the example, but just in terms of, is everybody happy with the approach that we're going to be following and the overview that Dave's given? Okay, so I'm getting a good number of thumbs up on that. So Dave, I think we're good to move into the first substantive item.
So the item that I will cover in a little more detail is agenda item 4.2.2, and this is the actual recommendation to approve the ED slide. Again, I won't go into actual approval of the ED, but there were a few points I wanted to talk about. The first was on the exposure period. So what staff is recommending is we have an exposure period ending March 1st, 2021 that provides just over a 4-month exposure period. The only comment I received from, and I believe it was one member, was they said the board should consider that will overlap for a month or so with the revenue exposure drafts that are out right now. I accept that comment. The only challenge I see is that regardless of where we move the timing of the exposure period, I think we're always going to have some kind of overlap, whether it's with revenue or whether it's with leases or other documents that are hopefully approved in December. So staff's recommendation is still to go ahead with the March 1st, 2021 ending of the exposure period.
Okay, so anybody disagree with that recommendation on the 4 months? Lindy.
Thank you. I guess it's a bit more than the overlap as well. I guess just sitting back and reflecting, we've gone through extensive consultation here on the ED 70 to 72, and it's almost like you just write your letter and you start again. And I wondered maybe in terms of just having some breathing space, you know, have a longer period that allows us just to kind of finish the one and then start looking at how we consult with the other. And then that doesn't cut into that exposure period.
Any other comments on period? Ross?
Just back on that, I can appreciate where Lindy's coming from and the pressure well, many constituents are probably feeling at the moment with all of the exposure drafts that will be coming up. But I would flag this is a fairly minor set of changes as well. We're not changing any of the actual principles in the borrowing cost standards. We're just adding clarification examples to help with their application. So I'd be a little hesitant to be a little over cautious on this particular one. I think it's one we should try and get out there, get out for comment, and kind of clear out of the way before the bigger group comes out later in the year. I think if it gets approved at this meeting, it would be published likely in October. So yeah, there will be some overlap, but I think we're still proposing a full 4.5 to 5 months of time, which is a little bit longer than normal, and keeping it out of that period at the year end where we know a lot of people will be taking leave and vacation. So if you had anything specific in mind, Lindy, it'd be good to know, but I do struggle a little bit with giving too much time for this one.
Thanks, Ross. So I'll take Mike and Scott and then back to Lindy.
Thank you, Chair. So I sympathise with Lindy's point. I think she makes a good one, but I think Ross is right. I mean, for us in the Southern Hemisphere, we all closed down for January, so maybe not a lot of people around to write anyway. But I think as Ross said, it's not a controversial change. It's what pretty much people are expecting. So I'm happy with the March cutoff. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Scott.
Yeah, thank you. I'm comfortable with the change, but I started thinking when Linda commented, I don't think it's an issue here, but will this impact the other standards? We got to think about how they're going to feel about. We wouldn't want to distract, because this is a pretty low risk type of change, and we wouldn't want to have an impact on the other exposure drafts that are out there because of this one. But I'm fine. I would probably shorten it. But anyway, that was just my thought.
Thanks, Scott. I mean, I think, we have got a real challenge, as Ross said in his report, and in a sense, actually, we've created a problem for ourselves here in terms of the fact we've already extended the comment period on ED 70 to 72. So had we not done that, then essentially we'd have a window. I think it's going to be more important how we phase the release and the consultation periods on leases and the various components of the measurement package going forwards. I think it's sort of, there are challenges whichever way you go. Lindy, back on that.
Yes, I accept that. I think it is a challenge, and I think perhaps we can then say, well, we can agree on 1st of March. We were thinking end of March, but maybe we can just bear that in mind when we go into approving the other EDs and look at how it could potentially have an impact. Because I know it's a minor thing, but you also don't want people to ignore it.
Okay. Thanks for that, Lindy. And I think, I see thumbs up. People acknowledge the challenges, and it is small, but actually, it's quite important in terms of the principle and the approach going forward. Okay, so I think with that, we confirm the exposure period. Dave, back to you.
The next point I wanted to talk about was the title of the document. So staff kind of, I shouldn't say proposed, but thought of a few titles and ultimately landed on ED 74 amendments to IPSAS 5 borrowing costs. One suggestion that I heard from a member through the editorial comments process that I thought was a good one was keeping the same title, but after borrowing costs, either adding a comma or a semicolon, indicating that it was just implementation guidance and illustrative examples. And they thought that was a good way to really focus readers to indicate that we weren't changing core principles. I'm happy with both, but I thought it was a good suggestion. I thought it really, again, focused our readers on what we were changing.
Okay, so any strong views in favour of changing the title that we have at the moment, amendments to IPSAS 5 borrowing costs? Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I don't have a particularly strong view, but I think if we do want to signal that this isn't changing principles of the core standard, it could be helpful to refer to the fact that it is about the guidance and examples.
Thanks, Todd. Chris, you wanted to come in?
Yes, Chair. I'm thinking that since we are not changing any principles, it would be appropriate to communicate directly the action that has been taken on the document from the title. So that constituents don't just have to keep opening the document to know what changes have taken place. The title should actually tell them this is what has been done, and so you close your eye, from it. So I think the change of title is appropriate.
Thanks, Chris. So if we look at the current title, we've got amendments to IPSASB borrowing costs. And I'm looking at Todd and probably Chris here, as you've spoken in favour of a revised title. Are we looking at something like IPSASB borrowing costs, additional implementation guidance? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes.
Yes, Todd. Thanks, Chris. Todd, did you want to come in?
Yeah, the title that I had suggested today with my editorials was amendments to IPSASB borrowing costs, comma, implementation guidance and illustrative examples.
Mike.
Yeah, look, I'm trying to think of keep it simple. It's I think what Todd is saying, I would have thought we could cover with some sort of comms program or document on the website that says this is what this new ED is all about, rather than make it a long title.
Lynn.
I wasn't going to come in on this, and don't want to prolong the debate, but I did have a question mark in my mind about whether or not we are even amending if all we're doing is adding non-authoritative text.
Yeah.
So if we are changing the title, perhaps we should reflect on the word amendment, but I'm in favour of a shorter title generally, to be clear. So maybe minor enhancement.
I mean, Ross, over to you.
Yeah, I think Lynn's right. We normally don't change the title for something like this. So I think there's two ways forward. We could signal these changes in the title as proposed by Todd, or we could add something in the objective of the ED to make it crystal clear that we're just looking to modify the non-authoritative guidance to support the principles already in the standard. I think technically from a due process point of view, there could be an option to make the change without exposure, but I don't think that would be the right approach. I think we should allow people to comment and whether they're happy with the changes. We could potentially shorten the timeline if we didn't want to go longer, but having the earlier discussion and Lindy's point, I'm not sure a shorter approach would be all that useful either. I do think we should allow constituents to comment on whether it is helpful and if we've captured the points that have been raised appropriately from their perspective. So I guess the end of my long intervention is I think we can signal it through the title change. It would be a little bit different than normal, but I think this is a different circumstance than normal. Or if we weren't comfortable in the title, we could build that into the objective to make it more clear in the ED that we are just looking to change the non-authoritative supporting material to clarify the principle. Ian, you're on mute.
I think that's the catchphrase for this year, actually. Lindy, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Again, not to be editing in the meeting, but perhaps it's just non-authoritative amendments to IPSASB borrowing costs.
Thanks, Lindy. I think that's helpful. I see thumbs up to that, including from Todd. So if we go with that, non-authoritative amendments to IPSASB borrowing costs, that is a kind of does what it says on the tin title. Okay, that's good. So Dave, where do you want to go from here? I had it in mind that as it's relatively short, we would just walk through the document to pick up any other changes, and I'd just like to focus people on that proposed change on the examples that you were talking about?
Sure. My last question to the board was whether there are any other issues, but we can do it through a page flip as well, if you want.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's probably the easiest thing. We'll just walk through. Obviously, I'm not looking for editorials, but it's just any substantive points seems to be the easiest way to pick it up. So anything on page 3? Patricia.
Thank you. I sent the notes yesterday, but I think one is not only editorial, but changing in the content too. In EG A3, I think the point is not about the appropriation, but about the source of financing, because normally the entity needed the appropriation to construct the qualifying assets. But then I think the point is not about the appropriation. I sent the comment. According to IPSASB 24, appropriation is authorization to allocate funds. Normally, if, for example, entity, control entity when the control entity receive the funds for controlling entity, the controlled entity needed to appropriation, needed to authorization to construct the qualifying assets. And during the review, and not only H3 but H4 too, I have doubts about if it's the same economic entity or in between entity in different economic entity. I think this is a main point here, because if the entity receives another the entity of another economic entity, it's is different. It's my main point. I don't know if
so you've left slightly
possible to understand. I think IPSA 5 presents principles related to borrowing costs applicable to economic entity. In some situations, a controlled entity, for example, a state public university, has an appropriation to construct and qualify assets whose source of funding is a transfer of a controlled entity. In this case, the controlled entity may or may not capitalize the borrowing costs according to IPSAS 5, according to paragraph 26 and 228. Maybe the intention in the EG 83 was to approach the funding of other entities that do not compound the economic entity, for example, transfer from federal government to state government. Regardless of the financial source, the public entity needs to have an appropriation, normally by approved budget, for constructing a qualifying asset. So the appropriation does not seem to be the point of decision. The source of finance does. My suggestion is clarifying the main subject in discussion in AG A3. This relation with illustrative example 14, because in the illustrative example 14 has the situation that the part of the finance is the source of part of finance is the federal government. And then my suggestion is try to connect the EG if EE. Sorry, illustrative example. And I suggest to link the content of implementation guide and illustrative example with a specific paragraph of IPSAS 5. I think it's help to constituent understand the additional guidance too. I'm not sure. Yeah,
okay, thanks.
That is my point.
So, Dave, in terms of picking up the point that Trisha's made.
So, sorry, Patricia, thank you. I did receive your comments this morning. I did take a look, and I'm sorry I haven't gotten back to you yet. I do tend to agree with your comments. I was trying to use appropriations to make the example more public sector specific, but if it's causing concerns, it doesn't necessarily be to an appropriation. So I'm happy to work with you to move away from that terminology. I'm trying to illustrate something different than necessarily being an appropriation. So I'm happy to work with you on that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I see thumbs up on that. Okay, so that will come back. So Dave, to be clear, this will come back. We'll see the proposed changes in markup for approval on Tuesday.
Yeah, so I'll get everything out by the end of the week so that members there won't be a lot of changes, but you'll have the weekend to take a look and then you'll be able to vote on Tuesday.
Okay. So I want to go back and just step through this page by page to make sure we have picked up everything, so we're not picking up additional points. So, Mike, I'm on page 3 at this point.
Yeah, look, I'll go to page 3 in a moment, Chair. I just wanted to just help out there because the change Patricia's making, I agree it should be marked up, but then I wonder, Dave, whether you shouldn't accept the markup changes that are already in the document so we can see what new changes have been made. I think it'll be easier if we just accept the current changes and then we can see what's new. Sorry, Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think it's helpful on that process. So yeah, we will, and I see thumbs up on that. So the version that comes back will accept the changes that are marked up at the moment. It will only be the changes coming through that have been proposed by members offline as editorial amendments or any substantive changes arising from the discussion that we're having at the moment. Okay, so thanks for that clarification. Just anything on page 3, page 4. Then page 5, we get to the basis for conclusions. Todd and then Mike. Todd, are you on basis for conclusions?
I'm on page 4.
Okay.
Minor point, which will get picked up through editing, but there seemed to be duplication in the middle of this page with what was on the previous page. But it talks about guidance for the terms qualifying assets and directly attributable, and I'm not sure that that's the best way of describing this, because it seems that this guidance is more about determining the extent to which borrowing costs could be capitalised when you sort of look at it in total. So the point sort of comes up in about 3 different places on page 4, and I would suggest that it would be better not to talk about sort of the qualifying assets and the directly attributable, but to genericise what we're talking about in those places on page 4. Don't know whether that's editorial, but I have provided those comments to staff.
Mike, are you on that point or are you on something else?
Well, I think if we take on board what Todd's saying, it may solve my problem anyway. I know this is editorial, but I just wondered in the very first sentence, the word interpretive worries me because we don't provide interpretation. I would just drop it. But is that one of the things you'd solve, Todd, with your suggestion? Yeah.
Okay. So I think obviously, Dave, going back to you, you've got Todd's suggestions in terms of just fixing the drafting to avoid that problem. So my suggestion would be that you agree those with Todd and cross-check with Mike, and then we'll see we'll see the results of that in markup in the revised version. Okay. So page 5, basis for conclusions. And then page 6 is also basis for conclusions, as is page 7. Lynn, where are you?
I'm on page 7. It was just the style thing in BC 13 and 14, where we've got the use of examples. And I just wondered if that was what we normally do in BCs, or whether or not the examples shouldn't be there. I didn't object to them, but it was a style thing. We haven't deliberated those specific examples as part of the board deliberations, I don't think, unless now is when we're doing that.
So Lynn, I agree, they haven't been deliberated by the board. I had included them to, I'll say, clarify the point and make it more understandable to readers. I'm happy to discuss them. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I don't think it's necessarily different than what we've done in other BCs, but the board hasn't specifically deliberated these items.
Ross, from a generic point of view, I mean, I think Lynn's right to raise the question, because this is fundamentally this is supposed to explain our thinking, but then, there is this point that we're wrestling with in a number of areas at the moment about to what extent are we providing authoritative guidance, or is there a danger that you give guidance elsewhere, either through IGs, IEs, so we risk that through putting something in basis for conclusions.
So I think these bases for conclusions are meant to capture the board's thinking on these IEs and IGs they've added. So I think we could probably take it out and we're not going to lose a lot, because the IEs and the IGs have been added in the actual following text. So, I don't think it hurts if everyone's comfortable, but at the same time, we might be over-explaining by saying it in the BCs and then repeating it in the new guidance. So if there's a concern from Lynn and others are sharing that concern, I would say we just take it out and clarify the thinking, and the actual example guidance is what follows in the IGs and IEs.
Thanks, Ross. I think that makes sense. And we do have to guard against people, picking up on particular examples and so on and using them. Dave.
I just wanted to come back. I don't disagree with Ross or Lynn taking out the examples, but I just wanted to be clear that the examples here aren't duplicated in any way in the IGs or IEs, because we're talking about a different aspect. In the BCs here, we're talking about transaction costs and why borrowing costs differ from transaction costs. And the IGs and IEs provide different examples. So again, I'm not opposed to taking the examples out in the BCs. I just wanted to clarify just what the change will mean.
But I think in responding to that, Dave, I mean, I think, if they are transaction costs is something that we're dealing with in ED 77. So I think we need to avoid mixing things up. So I think the proposal would be arising from Lynn's comment that we delete the references to examples and just make sure that there's nothing further that then requires clarification, because I think we should be, the basis for conclusions should in all cases be explaining thinking, but not providing, not giving the sort of examples. Okay, so there'll be deletions then in 13 and 14. Lindy.
Thanks. Does that mean then the example gets moved to either implementation or illustrative examples? Or do we just explain the principle and we leave it?
I think we explain the principle. Okay, so there'll be deletions of those there. Then we're on the implementation guidance on page 8. We've already got the point that Patricia raised on A3. Any other points? Chris, you wanted to raise something. Are you on page 8?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm looking at the comment on A3 that when the acquisition, construction, or production of a qualifying asset is fully funded through appropriation, there will be no directly attributable borrowing cost to capitalize. I think in practice, that's not entirely correct, because government budgets for borrowing, and this is included in appropriation. Some of these borrowings are tied to specific asset infrastructure, for instance. The fact that it's been budgeted for and appropriated does not mean that there will be no cost to borrowing, even though it has been appropriated. The issue is that the costs of the borrowing is impracticable to be incorporated in the appropriation. That is why it is not budgeted for. Therefore, the statement that there will be no borrowing cost to capitalize because of appropriation, I don't think it's a strong argument. In practice, government budget for borrowing, and then after the appropriation, the borrowing proper is done in the open market, and that is when you now determine the cost. You cannot envisage the cost during appropriation. I don't know what I'm clear.
I think it's striking the balance here, isn't it? Because I think the point that was being made was that there is no hypothecated cost to pass through, that the borrowing is being, as you say, being done in the open market by whoever runs the borrowing for the government, even if they have in mind that they've got, I don't know, a big piece of investment to undertake. That's still being done through the normal general borrowing process. And I think that, and I'll come back to you in a moment, Dave, I think that was the intention behind the wording about no directly attributable borrowing costs. So was intended to get at that. Dave, additional thoughts from you on this?
No additional thoughts. I'll just work with Patricia and Chris on the wording here.
Okay. I think we just need to get that over. It's the fact that it's not, it is that directly attributable was the piece of wording that was intended on that. Okay. Then anything else on page 9? And then we move into the illustrative examples, page 10, page 11, page 12. Okay, so Dave, you've now got a number of pieces of editorial to address, picking up Todd's comments, addressing Patricia's point, potentially linked with the point that Chris made. there's some other pieces of editorial you received. Any other substantive points from members? Okay, so process-wise then, Dave, you'll accept the changes that are in there in track changes at the moment. We'll see those additional changes in track changes. You're proposing this comes to members by the end of the week? And then we will take a vote on this on Tuesday. Dave, anything else to add at this point? Okay. That's good. So I'm now going to propose we take a break at this point in time, and we come back at 5 to the hour, or whatever hour that is for you. So 10-minute break, and then we'll move into item 5, public sector specific financial instruments. Okay, thanks everyone.
1 minute. 1 minute.
I thought I missed that bell, but I don't miss that bell.
Yeah, first time we've heard from you today, Dave.
It might not be the last either.
Right, David, turn the volume down slightly, David. That's fairly brutal. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just give another short while, and then Dave will be ready for you to lead us. Oh, is that? Yeah, Ross, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, while we're waiting to get started, if I could just note to the board that the 2020 handbook has been published and is now available in PDF form on the IPSASB website. And thanks to Joao for working with the comms department to get that updated and ready to go. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross, and well done, Joao. That's been a fairly frustrating experience over previous years. So thanks for doing that. It is really important in terms of our outputs. Ross, just on that, I don't know if you want to say anything just very briefly about the project that's underway at the moment in terms of future guidance.
Yeah, I'm happy to just give a quick overview and update on an interesting process and one that I'm very happy that IFAC has decided to invest in. At the moment, we're working on developing a digital handbook publication on a common platform for all of the IFAC SSBs. So IFAC's hired a technology consultant to help us digitize the standards and will give us a very highly functional, very easy to use and visually appealing, modern looking digital handbook at the end of the process. Ian's been given a few glimpses of it, and I think and I've been involved in the process every step of the way since early June, having meetings, 3-4 hours a week with the consultant. We're coming to a critical stage where they're going to ingest our standards into the digital platform, which is a big step to basically take our 3,000 pages and make them a digital product. This is where it'll start to get interesting in terms of the process, because they have to make sure everything makes it into the handbook and start adding things like linkages so that it gets full digital authorization. The only thing I don't want to get into too much detail now. Probably in December, we might be able to give you a look at what this product's going to look like. And I know I asked many of you to complete a survey of digital features about a month and a half ago. So we might give links to view the prototype once that's been developed, so members can play around with it and see it before it goes live. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, it's quite an exciting endeavor, and IFAC's really taking it serious and giving great support across the SSBs. And I really think cautiously optimistic that there'll be a really great product at the end of this that'll really take us leaps and bounds above our current PDF copy of the handbook. So thanks, Ian, for the chance to have a quick word on that.
I mean, I was very impressed in the demo that I had, and I thought that this will be a big step forward, as you say, and I think it will help with the focus on adoption implementation as well. Plus it will help with feedback on what's actually being done in various different jurisdictions in terms of use of the standards. So I think the whole thing is actually, it's really exciting, actually. Okay, so now we move into public sector specific financial instruments and towards approval of the pronouncement. And Eileen, are you leading or is it Dave? Both.
Eileen's leading.
Yeah, I'll be leading, and I'd be happy to pass it on to Mark just to give some opening remarks on the project first. Mark, are you okay with that ordering?
Mute first, yes, thank you, Eileen.
No worries.
That's fine, I can make some introductory words. I think it's just a general comments I will give here. I would say we've made significant progress on this public sector specific financial instruments projects since its inception in 2015. I would say thanks to collective efforts by the board, by the CAC members, but also by the constituents. The board had a great discussion in the July meeting about the task force recommendation, which it made based on analyzing the ED responses. As the task force has found, the July discussions were actually a great reminder of actually how much history there is in the project over the last 5 years. And there's especially a lot of history in how and why the IPSASB responded to constituents' comments. And it was a refresher, I have to admit, for myself included, although I have been part of the project since 2015, about all the decisions actually that the IPSASB has made from developing the CP to the ED, which we have now, building up the project. And I can of course appreciate also the challenge for other members in keeping track of all of this, and especially if you're not close to the project. In that regard, I was very glad that we could have very good July discussions. Now, what has happened since July? Staff considered the board comments and instructions from this July meeting and made changes. Having reviewed these changes as task force chair just a couple of weeks ago, it struck me that the changes were mainly editorial in nature. And from my perspective, this is also a reminder of actually how strong the support was by the constituents for the ED, and also an indication that we ended up in the right place. Today, I will summarize the editorial changes. We will summarize, sorry, not me, but staff and me will summarize the editorial changes, communicate the due process, and then finally seek board approval of the final amendments to IPSAS 41. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And I think that involvement of the task force has been a vital ingredient all the way through on this project, and indeed on the main financial instruments project. So thanks everyone for the time that you've taken in terms of inputting to that process and taking us through from the discussion that we had in July, which I think was also a good discussion, and it raised a lot of issues. And as you say, this has been in process a long while, and so there's getting into the thinking about how we've got to where we've got to and so on. Eileen, over to you and to Mark as appropriate then, in terms of taking us through the summary of the updates that have been made.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. Okay. So hello again, everyone. I wanted to first echo Mark's point and extend my sincere thanks to the board for helping us bring this project to the stage. Without repeating the agenda item too much, I just wanted to highlight that the changes, which may appear a little voluminous in the track changes in 5.3.1, are more editorial in nature. These changes are intended to improve the overall flow and the narrative of the basis for conclusions and ensure that the key board decisions are clearly captured. We need some clarifications on just wording to make sure that we can avoid confusion as much as possible. We have received a few minor editorial comments already from members and technical advisors, which we've considered and processed as well as appropriate within the final pronouncement. A lot of them are just, plurals where we've accidentally put a singular, and also some additional wording clarifications. But overall, very minor changes, and we've appreciated everybody's time on that as well.
And sorry, Eileen, just to interrupt you on that, to underline that as with any final announcement, this will go through that editorial process
Yes.
to make sure that those sort of odd bits like plurals and singulars and so on are picked up through that. So, although we'll be voting on the document, those minor edits will be picked up through that process. And again, anybody that wishes to be part of that to contact you and to let you know they want to be part of that editorial panel. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I didn't actually have anything further to add, so I'd be happy to open the call now for any additional board comments.
Okay, thanks, Sonny. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised. Oh, Lucy.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'm just reflecting on what we did on ED 74, which was originally titled Amendments to IPSAS 5 Borrowing Cost. Since this is only amendments, additional non-authoritative amendments, can we also be consistent in renaming these pronouncements to non-authoritative amendments to IPSAS 41?
Thanks, Lucy. I think that is a good spot. Anybody see a reason why we shouldn't make that change? Okay, that's good. So I think with that, then we move through to the next paper, which is on the approval process for the pronouncement.
I'll just share my screen here again. So I'll provide a quick overview of our due process and overall, the IPSASB issued the ED 69 back in August 2019, and it only proposed additional non-authoritative guidance for IPSAS 41. Since then, the board has reviewed task force recommendations in July on the 19 comment letters received, and we've actioned the instructions and presented them just now with the last agenda item. So right now we are looking for five items from the board. Specifically, first, confirm whether the board is satisfied that there are no additional issues to be discussed and that due process has been followed effectively. We're looking today for approval on amendments to IPSAS 41, a title change per Lucy's comment. We'd also like to confirm that there are no substantive changes to ED 69 so that re-exposure necessary, and we're also proposing an effective date of January 1, 2023 in consistency with the IPSAS 41 change from ED 73.
Okay, so let's just step through those. I want to just check that everybody, nobody disagrees that we followed due process on this. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is just a clarification. Are we supposed to have item D, C before D? Actually, it should be the other way around, confirming there has been no substantial change before we now approve the amendments. I don't know, just the location of the procedure. I need an explanation. Is that okay?
Yeah. Can you just take us back to the slide and Ross, if you could comment?
So Ian, I can comment on this if you want.
Sure, thanks, Dave.
So part of the reason that I told Eileen we have to do this slide is because this is a confusing process for me, at least. The reason why we approve the standard first as is the board has to approve whether they agree with what's written. And then we take a step back and decide whether there's been any substantive changes from the exposure draft and whether this needs to be re-exposed. So step one is approving what's written, and then we decide whether it's different enough to re-expose.
Thanks, Dave. Chris, okay with that?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, thanks. So are we okay then in terms of due process?
Yeah, and just to be clear, in Eileen's paper, I've made my assertion that due process has been followed, but I'll also reaffirm the key points for the record. So ED 69 was issued for consultation and posted publicly for comment. All the comments received have been made publicly available on the website. All the key matters have been deliberated and significant decisions will be recorded in the draft minutes. And the IPSASB has been asked if there are any issues that haven't been noted that need to be raised. And with that, I make my assertion as the program technical director that due process has been followed. You're muted, Ian.
So that then moves us through to the vote. Okay, so Ross, if you can take us through that.
Yeah. Eileen, can you please take your screen down? Thanks. So similar to the last vote, first, I'm going to ask if anyone would like to vote against the proposal to please raise their hand. And I'm confirming I don't see any raised hands voting against. Second, I'd like to ask if anyone would like to abstain from voting for this pronouncement to please raise their hand. I'm not seeing any hands going up to abstain. And lastly, for approval, if you approve, please leave your hand down. And I'm not seeing anyone putting their hand up to note that they don't approve. So with that, I'd like to record that we have 17 votes for approval of the final pronouncement, and we have 1 absent, as James Jung is not in attendance at the meeting, and the pronouncement's been approved.
Okay, thanks for that, Ross. So then we move on to the next step in the approval process. So Eileen, if you can put your slide up again. And so this is the consideration of anything that would cause us to consider re-exposure.
And so on this one, Ian, I can confirm as a program and technical director that there are no significant changes from the ED that would require re-exposure or that have arisen through the discussions. You're on mute again, Ian.
Anybody disagree that with the proposal that re-exposure is not required? Okay. And then that moves us on to the effective date proposal.
And then the final point that the effective date should be aligned with the deferral of the effective date for IPSAS 41. Which for the records, January 1st, 2023.
Okay. Anybody disagree with that? Okay, so with that, we have a final pronouncement with that same effective date as IPSAS 41, which you know, is a huge achievement. It's been a long process. I mean, you mentioned 2015. I remember the first time we actually said we needed a separate project on this, which I think was about 2008. In a meeting at OECD in Paris when Janine Poggiolini, who many will remember from South Africa, the former board member and deputy chair, when she was a member of staff taking us through this. So it has been a very long process indeed. So well done to everyone involved. And once again, many thanks to the task force and for all the hard work that's gone into this, as well as to staff. Rod, you wanted to make a comment.
Thank you, Chair. Just to thank Ross and staff for the very high quality of work. My observation is that following in John Stanford's footsteps, Ross has taken on the role improving the documentation along with staff. And I, certainly as a board member, I must say I have a very high level of confidence in the work that Ross and staff does. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rod. Agreed, and it probably is right to say that this was one of Ross's first projects. I think there's consultation paper on this.
It was. You can blame me for how long it's taken. This is the first project I ever worked on, and I got to be honest with you, a few points it made me want to not be a standard setter, but I'm glad to see it finally come to fruition.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Over to you.
Yeah, I would, as task force chair, I would also like to use this opportunity to especially thank the great work that staff has done in the last 5 years. I remember when I started my first meeting in Brussels, 2014, when I was TA of the former chair. This was actually my first project. I was put into the task-based group at that time. It was headed by Ross. And then it turned sometime into a task force. We went to Amsterdam, and then it was Dave taking over. And now finally, in the last stages, it was Eileen taking over. And it was really a pleasure to work with all of you over 5 years. I mean, the final document is not very long, but what's behind and all these preparing documents, the discussions we had very deeply, we could have a look into the IMF, how it works, and it was really a great experience. So I want to thank you everyone for this great project, and I hope we can meet in person to also celebrate it in a small group of this long journey that we could finally now come to an end. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And in terms of bringing it to an end, the final item that we need to think about was the staff Q&A that we agreed that we should issue alongside this. And we're not going to, it's not an authoritative pronouncement, but I think it's important that we do communicate both the history and some of the thinking behind it in that. Eileen, do you want to just comment on work that's already gone into that, you know, certainly that's one thing where we appreciate the work that the contribution Adrienne's already made in terms of making sure the right thinking goes into that. So Eileen.
Yep, absolutely. I'm just going to quickly share this slide, which has the 4 questions. And I guess before I launch into it, I want to extend my thanks as well to the board. Really happy that it's gotten approved and to be part of this very long-standing project. So the Q&A that we have included in the agenda item for information purposes has 4 questions, 2 of which are specific to monetary gold, as that was an area where we often had a few more comments. So the plan right now is to go through one, how we chose the items for consideration under this project and whether they are or not public sector specific financial instruments. Then we would like to move into whether monetary gold is accounted for and distinguished under IPSAS. And this is where we've had a lot of help from Adrienne as well to make sure that as we are putting together this staff Q&A to highlight the importance of the whole of government consideration as well. Question 3 would be why the IPSAS addresses monetary gold from a public sector perspective. And 4, does IPSAS include examples developed for public sector items? One thing we wanted to mention as well is that even though it is a staff document and not an authoritative item, we'd be happy to hear from other members as well, particularly if you have a passion for the PSSFI project, and we'd be happy to touch base in Q4 as we're working on preparing this document to issue in concurrence with the amendments to IPSAS 41. And with that, I'd like to open up to hear more.
Thanks, Eileen. Yeah, and I think the Q&A actually are proving very useful in terms of non-authoritative communication mechanisms. Certainly the one that we did on COVID-19 has actually, been very helpful, I think, in raising our profile. And so I think we're sort of developing our thinking and our process on these as we go. So Adrienne, you wanted to come in.
So I just wanted to say thank you to staff, to Eileen and Dave for responding to my concerns. They really were motivated by the comments on monetary gold, where I thought we need to do more. We need to answer these questions. And I thought staff was very flexible and agile in bringing in this. So I'm very happy with the way we're going. Thank you very much to staff.
Thanks, Adrienne. And I think I think this, as we had last time around, it is important to answer these questions, because if board members were uncertain, then certainly we needed to make sure that we explain these things to our constituents as well. So thanks for that input, and thanks to others in advance of your input. So I think that genuinely is it, Ross, unless there's anything else you can think of.
No, I think we can close the book.
Okay, excellent. So thanks everyone for that. Nice to draw a line. Okay, so with that, we're slightly ahead of schedule today, but we've actually got 40 minutes to run. So bearing in mind the pressure on business that we've got this week, I'm proposing that we move on then to the leases item, because I understand from Ross that João is ready and rearing to go on that. So João, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to share the screen. Is it seen by everyone?
Yeah,
we can see it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So before starting my presentation, I just would like to say that we have 5 agenda items. Some of them respond to the board's instructions from the June meeting, and we also have one that is new on the discount rate, but it is related also to the instruction that the board gave at June meeting to assess the lessee's the discount rate. And with this, and before going through the issues, I'll pass the word to Mike as a task force chair to provide a report back to the IPSASB on the work done by the 2 groups that we have on the leases project, one on the task force itself and the other one on the request for information review group. So with this, I'll pass to Mike.
Thanks, João, and thanks, Jens. So just a couple of comments before João gets into the detail of the slides. That slide focuses on who the task force members were, and thanks to those of you who participated in the phone hookup that we had a couple of weeks ago, which chatted about the key issues that I'll come to in a moment around getting ED 75 wrapped up and presented to you today in the form that it is. And we had a separate group that looked at the request for information, which then included, in addition to the task force members, Scott Anthony and Vanessa Seeley Fisher from New Zealand. So thanks for their input, and thanks to New Zealand and South Africa for their comments on access rights, which were then built into the RFI that you've got today. I then wanted to just have a look in your papers. The very first page in your papers on this agenda item goes through the 6 or 7 items that we want to get dealt with today. The first one is a discussion we had around differences between incremental borrowing rates and likely interest rates. So Joao's got a paper on that, and that was quite a good discussion that we had, primarily resulting in a decision of the task force and the staff that this was not a public sector specific uniquely item, and therefore it didn't require any additional change to the scope of the project, although we'll get on to in a moment about the nature of additional guidance that might be provided. We also had a good discussion around the scope of this project. The scope of the project, board members will remember when we had the meeting back in June, we decided we should make this an alignment project and therefore make as few changes to IFRS 16 as possible. That resulted in the scope not changing. There was a discussion about should we change the scope to explicitly exclude concession releases, and we decided we would not change the scope because that's going to be dealt with through the RFI process. And until the RFI process is finished, if the lease is a concessionary type lease, then it's got to be dealt with within ED 75. I suppose that's all I was going to just highlight, Ian. A lot of things were chatted about, and they're all going to come up as different phases during the course of this meeting. And maybe, Joao, back to you to go into the detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I just want to compliment Mike's by thanking the task force and the review group for the excellent work that they've put into reviewing those two documents. So even from the task force, what they did was above and beyond what the board has asked back in June, which was only to see the illustrative examples, but they reviewed the whole exposure draft, and thanks for that. So, and with this, we can jump to the issues. I don't know if Ian, you want to say anything, or can I start? Okay. So the first agenda item is a direct response to the board's instruction to assess the difference between the incremental borrowing rate and the likely interest rate implicit in the lease from the lessee perspective. So, as Mike said, the task force discussed this, and staff also had participation in those discussions. And what we concluded is that this is not a public sector specific issue. And actually, the ISB provided its conceptual thinking on how to address when the rate implicit in the lease is not available, and what are the steps that need to be done from the lessee in order to get that incremental borrowing rate. So those VCs, as it is in the issues paper, pretty much captures the ISB's conceptual thinking. And with this, staff and the task force recommend not to provide additional guidance in ED 75, but explain the IPSASB's thinking on this in a BC. So, and with this, I ask the board if it disagrees with the staff and task force recommendation.
Thanks, Shah. So open up for comments on that approach. So I'm not seeing any flags raised. So I think we're good with that approach.
Okay, thanks for the confirmation. So moving on to the next agenda item. The second agenda item, it is also related to the incremental borrowing rate, but in a different perspective, is when there is in practice some inability to determine the interest rate implicit in the lease and the incremental borrowing rate. Again, the staff and the task force discussed this issue quite extensively, and what we conclude is that this is not a public sector specific issue. In the private sector, there are also these issues. And so based on the same BCs that ISB provided, there is already some guidance on how to address that from the ISB's conceptual thinking. And that is why the staff and the task force concluded that it should be worthwhile to put BC in paragraph in ED 75, explaining also this issue together with the previous one. So, and with this, I ask the IPSASB whether it disagrees with this recommendation.
Thanks, Shah. Lindy.
I don't disagree. I think just in dealing with the basis for conclusions and writing it up, I think it would be important for us to make reference to the fact that the lease is concluded on market terms, because I think when we get to phase 2, you know, we might need to think of it differently. So I thought maybe just in these BCs be subtly or explicit that we're dealing with a certain type of leases. And I don't think you needed that in the IFRS environment, but I think there might be a difference just looking ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. That certainly sounds sensible, and I see nods in support of that proposal. Yeah, thumbs up as well. Okay. Any other comments from members? And obviously, we've yet to see the drafting on these, but that will come in December. Okay, so I think members support that. Sure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So going to the following agenda item. So we now enter into the exposure draft issues, and the first one that the staff addressed and thought it would be worthwhile to bring to the board's consideration in the sequence of what Ross spoke a few hours ago in his technical director's report, is what is the linkage between ED 75 and other IPSASB's current and developing literature. So what I'm about to explain, it applies not only to ED 75, but also to other EEDs. So although this hasn't been brought in other EEDs, but this should work as a good example how the other EDs that are being developed will also be applying the same principles set out here in this issue paper. So this is quite, how to say, an extensive work, and very, I would say, that needs to be dealt very carefully, because we have lots of wheels moving forward, some that are already part of our literature and others that are still developing, are already published, and others that are not yet published, but it will be published in the near future. And we need to see how all these literature that will be changing will look like for the constituents. And so staff has had several meetings within with the other staff lead projects, just to assess how this will be managed. So applying these principles to ED 75, there are two main things that the board needs to take into consideration. The first one is that the board needs to ensure that the effective date of ED 75 should not be earlier than the effective date of IPSAS 41 and the IPSAS, the final IPSAS based on ED 70 and ED 79. And why is that? Because as you could see in ED 75, there are cross-references throughout the core text of the ED 75 that make cross-references to other IPSAS, and because of that, it means that the final standard on leases will only work if it is also in place, the other standards being also effective. And this leads to the other side of the coin, which is ED 75 should require that public sector entities apply IPSAS 41 and the final IPSAS based on ED 70 and ED 79 at the same time or before applying ED 75. And that is written precisely in the effective date paragraph of ED 75, which is ED 75 paragraph 100, where we ensure the complete linkage between the IPSASB current and developing literature. And with this, I ask the board if it disagrees with the staff and task force recommendation.
Thanks, Shao, for that explanation. And I think it does confirm what we've seen for quite a long while, that actually there are a lot of interlinkages that we're going to have to manage. And it gets us into that issue. So if you can stop sharing your slide at the moment, and just see whether, you know, basically are board members happy with the thinking behind that? Does anybody have any concerns with the approach that João has outlined? Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I don't have any concern. Just to commend the hard work for seeing through the entire linkages. As I was reading through the material, I felt satisfied that we have touched the nitty-gritty of the work, the project that we are doing. So I just want to commend them. Very good job.
Thanks, Chris. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So thanks, Chris. And João, look, this got a lot of discussion by the task force as we went through editing or not editing ED 75. And João, I just think we should, whilst the board may be satisfied today, we just need to keep it on our agenda as things develop over the next 3 or 4 months. So we just need to revisit this perhaps in December to make sure we're still consistent with what you're saying here today, because things might change.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I mean, we are going to have to look at this and make sure that the final communication that goes out actually is very clear with people, you know, what the timelines are likely to be. And I think that also has some influence on comment deadlines and so on. So there's a lot of moving parts we need to keep track of. But what I'm sensing from the thumbs up from board members is that they appreciate the way that you presented it in the paper, and the thinking that's gone into it, and that we accept that thinking. Okay. Adrienne.
So it's more of a comment on I'd like to see how things develop. When I was going through this on the linkages, I wasn't really sure how much of it we might possibly be affected by information we get back on concessionary leases. And so it's more concern on my part that I don't see the whole thing clearly. Now, maybe this is not a great thing to raise, but I just wanted it to be on the record, because there's a risk that when we get the new information, I'll see this differently. Sorry.
Thanks, Adrienne. No, I mean, I think, you know, what we've seen, and this came up in our earlier debates, that concessionary leases is very, you know, there's a lot of different angles on this. There are a lot of other arrangements that potentially could fall to be treated as leases or might require some different guidance. And so that's really why we're approaching this through the request for information. I think, though, the decision we made in March was that in terms of something that is defined as a lease, and, you know, we're using the definition aligned with IFRS 16, that this is the accounting that will go in the ED, then whether you can apply that to other types of arrangements or whether we need some other guidance is something that we'll get the RFI, hopefully we'll get the information through that process. So it'll provide, a richer picture, but it won't change our core view that actually leases are, we should have aligned guidance with IFRS 16 for conventional leases. We've got comments from Mike and then David.
Thanks, Chair. Joao, just remind me, when we had the discussion about scope, did we agree to put a BC in that said we thought about changing the scope to deal with concession releases explicitly, and they decided just to deal with it as BC? I just can't recall where we landed. And the second thing was, even if we don't put a BC in, I think as part of the comms process, we need to make sure that when we issue the RFI, that's phase 2, and we're going to deal with concession releases at that point.
Yes, Mike, thanks for question. So I can confirm that the staff and the task force have agreed to include the BC in the exposure draft section of the BC. So it is not yet there, but it will be developed for the December meeting together with the task force and explaining the IPSASB's thinking behind of that exclusion from the ED 75, and because it will be dealt within the RFI.
Thanks, Joe. I think in doing that, just make sure you look at what's already there in terms of the reasoning, behind the discussion that we had in March, because clearly that was one of the factors that came into that. And I know, from having reviewed the text, that we have referred to that two-stage process that we've now got. So we just need to make sure it fits with that and bounces off that. David.
Thank you, Chair. No, I was just picking up on Adrian's point, but also referring back to the point that Lindy made, that we've got to be very clear, and this could be in BCs and comms, that this is a pure alignment project at the moment. And so that what we mean by a lease in ED 75 is exactly the same as a lease in IFRS 16, nothing else. What comes later from the RFI, as you say, may well then mean that we make amendments to what's in ED 75 or the standard that we develop from it. But that's a separate exercise, because we don't want people starting to wonder what on earth they should be doing with some of their peculiar arrangements. We're talking about proper leases as defined in IFRS 16.
Thanks, David, for underlining that. Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And I would just add to what David said. It's what is a lease, but also for both the lessee and the lessor. No change. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so with that, Shao, take us forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So entering now in the ED 75, I'll take again as read. And thanks for the task force for the very extensive review of the ED. So it was really great to have this joint work. So I have 5 items to seek the board's views. So the first one is whether it disagrees with how it was dealt in terms of the marked up terminology, changes in draft ED 75. So I'll stop here before going to the rest.
Okay, and you've summarised the terminology changes in the appendix to the paper,
yeah,
which all look to be standard to me.
Mm-hmm.
So just checking everyone's okay with those. Lindy.
Yeah, I might have raised my hand a bit too early. And I guess that's just on the use and the definition of fair value. And if we're going to align it at a later stage and keep the old one here. But otherwise, I agree with what we've done on terminology. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to pick up the point on fair value? Or I go to Lucy? Yeah.
Yes, thanks for raising that, Lindy. That is very important. So staff has discussed that with the task force and also with the staff led on the measurement project. And so just two ideas for the board to understand where we landed. So IFRS 16 does not use the fair value definition that it is in IFRS 13. This means that even from the IASB perspective, they have kept the old definition even before the IFRS 13. So having this in context, and as this is an alignment project, staff thought that, well, we shouldn't do any changes because IASB didn't do it. And for the ED75, and if there are any future changes arising from the measurement project, then those should be dealt as a consequential, but not now. Now it is early to do anything. The second idea is that personally, I don't think, I might talk too early, but I don't think that there will be any changes even from the measurement project. And this is also in agreement with the staff led on the measurement. Why is that? Because the IASB didn't change their definition, they still kept it. And there is a very good technical reason, I'll not get into the details, why we should still keep the definition that we have in ED75 aligned with IFRS 16 and not amended because of the measurement project. But I'll let that discussion going in the measurement project and not here. Thanks again, Lindy.
Okay. I mean, it is quite important, that point about which version of fair value we're using. I think the question in my mind, and I'm just sort of approaching this as a board member, is does it make a difference? Because it does seem strange to not use, if we're going to introduce fair value as defined in IFRS 13 into our literature, and we'll be doing that, you know, subject to comments on the EDs fairly quickly afterwards. It seems strange to not make a change for that. Now, is that a process issue?
I can clarify, perhaps this might help, Ian. Yeah. Well, I'm going to enter in a little bit into the weeds, but not much. So the reason is that the IFRS 16 definition of a lease, it is written in a way that it is applicable on one-to-one transactions where there is no third parties. The IFRS 13 definition of a lease, as it is written, it can be applicable having third parties involved in the transaction. And that doesn't really fit well in a lease, because a lease is a transaction between two parties and not having third parties involved into at the initial arrangement of that lease. And so there are more weeds, but I don't want to go there right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. David, and then I'll go back to Lindy.
Okay, thank you. Now, I was just going to ask, do we know why the IASB used an old definition of fair value? Because this standard was issued after the financial instrument standard and fair value. Do we know why?
Yes, one of the reasons is the one that I've just explained. And I'll be able, if the board wants, I'll be able to bring more detail, but right now that is one of the main reasons to retain the old definition in IFRS 16.
Okay, I'll just go back to Lindy and then summarize. Lucy, you're on a different point?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, so
Appendix A.
thanks. Lindy, back to you.
Yeah, so I guess what we're saying, it's kind of negotiated between the lessor and the lessee. But I think it would then be useful to actually have an explicit EC in our document that clarifies this and why we used it and the difference in terminology and why we've used this one in this standard for a specific purpose. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. That's certainly helpful. And I think, then explaining that in the context of the, the terminology that we're using elsewhere and developing in the measurement ED, I think that's going to be really important, because you could say, well, anyway, yeah, I think, but I think some further deliberation on that with the measurement team would be important. Thomas, are you on that point?
Yes, Ian, thank you. Just to kind of remember board members of the discussion we had in the CAG when talking about the terminology of fair value. I think if you talk about a value which is negotiated between the lessee and the lessor, you probably shouldn't use the term fair value as it is now kind of understood as being fair value, kind of like from IFRS 13. And I think the CAG really clearly recommended not to use the term fair value if you talk about something else than the IFRS 13 fair value, just for clarity reasons.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, it did sort of feel to me more like transaction price or whatever we choose to call it. So I think we might want to pick that up. Ross, and then I'll round up and move us on.
Thanks. I just want to note, though, we've kind of got a bit of a tension here between our policy if we're doing a pure alignment standard too, if we really want to change the terminology that the ISBs used, because they had this same issue when they made the decision. So I think we've clarified, and if we put a BC in, that should help us, but I'm not sure coming up with a different term for fair value as used in this standard would be all that helpful.
Thanks, Ross. So I think in terms of the instruction, I think we do need some further input from staff on this particular one. I think it would be helpful, it may well be helpful to A, liaise with the measurement staff on this, and B, make sure we fully understand why ISB didn't use the definition in IFRS 13. And then depending on the outcome of that, then we probably have options, and it may be that actually whatever we do here, we want to actually get input from constituents on this. So it may be that actually we need a specific matter for comments on this. Okay, João, are you clear on that going forward? We don't need to. I don't think we need to discuss it any further today, but I think that's the way forward on the issue.
Yeah, I just want to say that there is always an option, if this helps the board, to say that that definition of fair value is only to be applicable in the standard, in that standard. This is normal that we do this in other standards when we have a definition that has a different meaning or a specific meaning, that it is to be applied in that standard. This can be an option for the board to consider further.
Yeah, but I think Thomas's point still applies, that actually, maybe we should call it something different if it's not fair value as defined. So I think, we need further advice on that, in terms of the options on the way forward. Okay, Lucy, you've been waiting very patiently, so over to you.
Yes, thanks, Chair. This is about Appendix A. I think this is very useful in determining whether we have considered all the provisions of of IFRS 16 into ED 75, but I suggest that maybe we can rearrange the matrix, that instead of IFRS 16 on the left side, it would be ED 75 on the left side, and then we um, mention or identify all the IPSASB from 1 to 41, and then the terms used, or even the remarks on what provisions in the IFRS 16 were deleted would be presented alphabetically, so it would be easier to locate. Like for instance, if you're saying equipment was used in ED 75, this is manufacturing equipment used in um, IFRS 16. So it's just a rearrangement of the matrix in Appendix A. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Ross, can you just advise how we normally communicate these changes? Because I know at the back of each standard we have a high-level statement on the relationship of the announcement with the relevant IFRS.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I just want to clarify that these appendices in the back here were just for the board's purpose in reviewing what's going in the ED. In the actual amendments to other IPSAs that arise from ED 75 in the back, we do go in sequential order from IPSAS 1 all the way up, and we'll be in that format. I think we normally present it this way when we're just identifying the issues we've changed from the IFRS to the ED. So take your note on presentation, in the future we could consider flipping it, but these two tables aren't meant to be going in the ED or any publication document. It's just in the papers for board's discussion purposes.
Okay, thanks for that, Ross. Any other comments on terminology? Patricia?
I'm not sure about I think it's not only about terminology, but the content, because in the draft, the use of economic benefits is used without service potential. I think in AG 10, AG 22, it's necessary to add the potential services too. Not only the economic benefits, but potential services too. While the requirement of economic benefits is derived from the IFRS 16, the public sector not always leases an asset with the view of generate output and byproducts, or the economic benefits must to use for to order to activity their objectives. Then I think it's not only the terminology, but the to change the content to approximate to the characteristics of public sector. It's only not only AG, but illustrative examples too.
Thanks, Patricia. João or Ross, back on that. I mean, I think there is something though in that what we're talking about here is essentially arm's length transactions that are pure leases in the conventional sense. And actually the point that you're referring to may be something that we need to reflect in the RFI rather than in the actual aligned document. Ross, back on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if in a true alignment sense, I think we are talking about those that have economic substance and commercial type transactions. I don't think leases that, reflect service potential or, other calculations other than the cash flows coming from the lease contract are in scope for this standard or IPSAS 13 as written now.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So I've got Mike and then Todd.
Thanks, Jess. I hear what Patricia's saying, but I think we've tried to, or the task force has tried to go through and public sectorize the examples. We didn't make a lot of changes, but we did try to do that all the way through. And I think you're right, and I think the solution to Patricia's problem is to deal with that through the RFI. Otherwise, we're going to end up changing and not being directly aligned.
Thanks, Mike. Todd, you on this?
Yeah, I'm on the same point, and I have a different view. I think I agree with what Patricia is saying. I think there will be instances in this exposure draft where there's reference to economic benefits, where we do want to include service potential as well. And I think AG10, which Patricia pointed out, is probably a case in point, because it's what the asset is being used for by the public sector entity, and it won't necessarily be used for economic benefits for the entity. It could be used for service potential. So I think there is a point that Patricia's making that it's worth reflecting on, and it may not appear everywhere that economic benefits is used, but it will appear in some places, I think, where economic benefits are used in this exposure draft. And that is very much part of aligning from an IFRS to an IPSAS, that we do need to reflect on whether we should incorporate the term service potential in places, I think. So I think there is some work to do to take account of Patricia's point.
Okay, thanks, Todd. I mean, it may be that this is actually in not substantive text. It's actually the thinking behind it, because I think there's a difference between the fact that we're reporting on the transaction itself, not necessarily what the asset is actually used for. I think there is a distinction, and I think we're going to need to reflect on how best to communicate that point. And this may well be the point at which we say, right, okay, we'll wrap up and come back with a recommendation on that tomorrow. Lindy, comment from you, and then I'll take a final comment from Zhao.
Yeah, so I take the point. I think we just need to be careful and look at the context of the paragraph to decide whether or not we need to add it. And not just go and add service potential with every economic benefit, because I think sometimes it's appropriate to have one and not the other. I did have a look at IPSAS 13 to see what we did, so maybe that's also a useful exercise, but I think we just need to be careful not to just blindly make the changes and consider the context.
Thanks, Lindy. Joao.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So going directly into Lindy's point, staff thought on this when developing the draft ED, although it didn't discuss with the task force, but well, I discussed with myself. And two reasons that staff decided not to include this. First was the Lindy's point on the service potential. Sometimes might be appropriate, sometimes might not be appropriate. And because of that, it would lead to quite, I would say, large deviation from what the board is intending with ED 75, which is an IFRS 16 alignment standard. So if that is the case, doing any changes to include service potential here would open a kind of a Pandora box with unintended consequences that would not be taken into consideration now. As a corollary of these two conclusions was, if the board wants to assess these in further detail, then the proper place is to assess these in the second stage of the project, which is the RFI, if the board feels strongly that these should be discussed there, but not now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. I think probably this is the point where we have some further reflection overnight from staff and the task force chair before we come back to you with a response, Patricia, because I think you know, there is a question as to the point you make is very valid in terms of the reasons why public sector organisations hold assets. And there's a tension between that and the fact that we're talking about here essentially commercial leasing transactions. So you may enter into essentially a commercial arrangement, but to provide a service using that asset, which is, so that's where the service potential comes in. And I think it may well be that actually what we need to do is reflect that thinking, which may be that we haven't made that change in the standard, but we do acknowledge that. So there may be something through a basis for conclusion rather than necessarily in the RFI. But I think probably, it is an important point. So therefore, I'd suggest actually that we just have that offline deliberation on the best way to address your point and come back with a proposal on that tomorrow. So, because we are at a point in time where we need to wrap up now, but I want to make sure you get a substantive response and a way forward then on the point that you've raised. Okay, so with that as the way forward, I think we'll wrap up for today. Ross, anything process-wise before we close?
No other process items other than we'll pick up Lisa's midstream tomorrow to finish off the item. We'll take away this last point of discussion and have a discussion within staff and try and engage with any members that it's still a reasonable hour on to see if we can get a resolution. So I won't guarantee that we'll have any answer on this issue yet, but I think it's clear what we need to look at. And whether we get that back to you tomorrow or later in the meeting when we have a moment, I think we just need to allow for the time differences and more noting that I think it's quite late for Mike and he's the task force chair, and whatever solution we land on, we'd like to give him the benefit of seeing first. Okay,
you're quite right. I was thinking actually the time zone works for Patricia, even although it's been an early morning for you. But you're right, Mike does deserve some sleep. Mike, final point, and then we'll close today.
Thanks, Chair. Just to remind you, we've still got to discuss the RFI tomorrow, so we haven't quite finished this agenda item.
Absolutely not. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. Very good day, I think, in terms of, we've approved the 2 final pronouncements, and we did a lot of good work on ED 74 as well as getting into leases. So thanks very much for the input. Thanks to staff for the materials, and see you tomorrow morning. Sorry, see you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.